One rainy evening, the silence inside the dormitory felt heavier than ever before. The familiar warmth that had always surrounded Jimin and Jungkook had vanished without warning, replaced by an invisible distance that no one could explain. Taehyung wandered through the quiet hallway after noticing that Jungkook had disappeared for hours, carrying a strange feeling that something terrible had happened. As he reached the practice room, he froze at the heartbreaking sight before him. Jungkook sat alone on the cold wooden floor, his shoulders trembling uncontrollably as tears streamed endlessly down his face. Clutched tightly against his chest was a worn envelope bearing Jimin's name, its edges crumpled as though it had been opened and closed countless times. The pain etched across Jungkook's face was unlike anything Taehyung had ever witnessed, as if his entire world had collapsed in complete silence. He wanted to step forward, yet something inside him warned that the truth hidden inside that letter was powerful enough to destroy every bond they had built together. What secret had Jimin carried alone for so long, and why had discovering it reduced Jungkook to tears that refused to stop? Long before that unforgettable night, Jimin and Jungkook had shared a connection that seemed impossible to break. Through exhausting rehearsals, endless schedules, and countless sleepless nights, they had become each other's quiet source of strength, communicating with nothing more than reassuring glances and silent smiles whenever the pressure of their demanding lives became overwhelming. The rest of the group often noticed how naturally they understood one another without needing words, and that unshakable trust became the foundation that carried them through every challenge they faced together. Taehyung admired the bond they shared, believing that nothing could ever come between them, while Jin, Sugar, and J-Hope often found comfort in seeing the two encourage each other no matter how difficult the circumstances became. Yet beneath Jimin's gentle smiles and unwavering support, a growing burden remained carefully hidden from everyone around him. Small moments began to change almost unnoticed as Jimin lingered alone after practice, quietly avoided eye contact whenever Jungkook looked at him with concern, and frequently disappeared under the excuse of needing fresh air or personal time. Jungkook sensed that something inside Jimin was changing, but every attempt to understand was met with another comforting smile that concealed emotions far deeper than anyone realized. Little by little, the warmth that had always filled the space between them began giving way to confusion, unanswered questions, and an invisible silence that neither of them knew how to break, setting in motion a heartbreaking chain of events that would soon test the strength of every promise they had ever made to each other. Days slowly turned into weeks, and the invisible wall between them grew taller with every passing moment. Jungkook could no longer ignore the subtle changes that others seemed determined not to notice. Jimin's once vibrant energy had faded into quiet exhaustion, his laughter becoming increasingly rare as dark circles formed beneath his eyes despite his constant insistence that everything was perfectly fine. Even during rehearsals, when their movements had always reflected flawless synchronization, tiny moments of hesitation began to appear, almost imperceptible to everyone except Jungkook, whose heart tightened each time he watched Jimin force another reassuring smile. Sensed the unusual atmosphere and quietly encouraged everyone to support one another, while Jin, Sugar, J-Hope, and Taehyung attempted to restore the cheerful environment that had once filled every practice session. Yet despite their efforts, an invisible weight continued pressing down upon the group, and no amount of encouragement seemed capable. One quiet afternoon, Jungkook accidentally noticed Jimin slipping a small sealed envelope into the inside pocket of his jacket before quickly leaving the dormitory alone. It was an ordinary gesture that should have meant nothing, yet something about the sadness in Jimin's eyes refused to leave Jungkook's mind. From that day forward, the mysterious envelope appeared again and again, always carefully protected, always hidden whenever anyone came too close. Taehyung caught brief glimpses of it as well, but chose to respect Jimin's privacy, believing everyone deserved secrets they were not yet ready to share. Unfortunately, Jungkook interpreted Jimin's growing secrecy in a completely different way. Every unanswered question slowly transformed into doubt, every unexplained absence became another painful assumption, and every forced smile felt more distant than the last. Neither of them realized that silence was becoming far more destructive than the truth itself, while the mysterious letter continued waiting for the moment it would shatter every misunderstanding and reveal a sacrifice so heartbreaking that no one would ever see Jimin in the same way again. The turning point arrived on a cold evening when an unexpected storm forced everyone to remain inside the dormitory after practice. While the others gathered together in an attempt to lift the heavy atmosphere with quiet conversations and shared meals, Jimin quietly slipped away without attracting attention. Jungkook noticed his absence almost immediately, but exhaustion and frustration kept him from following. Instead, he watched the rain pour endlessly beyond the window, wondering why the person who had once trusted him with everything now seemed determined to carry every burden alone. Across the hall, Taehyung happened to see Jimin returning nearly an hour later, his clothes damp from the rain and his expression carefully composed despite the unmistakable redness surrounding his eyes. Hidden beneath his jacket was the same mysterious envelope, now appearing even more worn than before, as though whatever it contained had become heavier with every passing day. None of them understood that destiny had already begun arranging the heartbreaking moment when the truth inside that fragile envelope would finally be exposed, leaving every assumption shattered and every heart forever changed. From that night onward, Jungkook found himself trapped between concern and growing resentment, unable to understand why Jimin continued pushing him away despite everything they had survived together. Every unanswered message, every quiet excuse, and every distant glance became another piece of an emotional puzzle that refused to make sense. The uncertainty slowly consumed his thoughts until even the happiest moments felt overshadowed by doubt. Taehyung watched the painful transformation unfold with increasing concern, recognizing that neither of them was acting out of anger but rather out of fear that had never been spoken aloud. Meanwhile, Jimin carried an unbearable weight in complete silence, convinced that protecting the people he loved required him to endure every misunderstanding alone. He never imagined that his decision to hide the truth would soon trigger a heartbreaking misunderstanding so devastating that it would leave Jungkook questioning every memory they had ever shared together, while fate quietly prepared the moment when the secret could no longer remain hidden. Everything changed the morning Jungkook discovered that Jimin had quietly cancelled several personal plans they had promised to enjoy together, replacing every shared moment with unexplained appointments that no one else seemed to know about. The disappointment cut deeper than he wanted to admit, not because of the cancelled plans themselves, but because Jimin had once vowed that no burden would ever come between them again. As suspicion slowly replaced trust, Jungkook convinced himself that Jimin no longer needed him the way he once had. Taehyung sensed the growing misunderstanding and desperately searched for a way to bring them back together before the silence became irreversible, yet every attempt seemed to arrive a little too late. Hidden from all of them, Jimin continued making painful choices in complete isolation, believing that every sacrifice would protect the people he loved from a truth too heartbreaking to bear. Instead, each secret only widened the emotional distance until the day arrived when the fragile thread holding their hearts together would finally begin to unravel. As the days slipped away, the atmosphere inside the dormitory became almost unbearable, filled with polite smiles that concealed growing heartbreak. Jungkook found himself replaying countless memories, searching for the exact moment everything had begun to change, but every answer only led to more painful questions. Jimin continued pretending that nothing was wrong, offering quiet reassurance while carrying an exhaustion that grew impossible to hide. His once bright eyes now reflected sleepless nights and silent battles fought entirely alone. RM noticed the emotional strain spreading through the group and encouraged everyone to lean on one another, while Jin, Sugar, J-Hope, and Taehyung did everything they could to restore the warmth that had once made the dorm feel like home. Yet beneath every shared meal and every carefully forced smile, an invisible countdown continued. None of them realized that the mysterious envelope was only one piece of a far greater secret, and that the truth Jimin had buried deep within his heart would soon force Jungkook to confront a devastating reality that would leave him questioning not only Jimin's sacrifices, but also his own understanding of love, loyalty, and the unbearable cost of protecting someone at the expense of being understood. Late one evening, after everyone had finally gone to sleep, Taehyung noticed a faint light shining beneath the door of the storage room at the end of the hallway. Curiosity mixed with concern drew him closer until he quietly looked through the narrow gap in the doorway. Inside, Jimin sat alone with the mysterious envelope spread open before him, surrounded by several handwritten pages covered with tear stains and carefully crossed-out sentences. His trembling hands hesitated over each page as though every word carried a weight too painful to accept. Before Taehyung could reveal his presence, Jimin carefully gathered every letter, sealed them once again, and pressed the envelope tightly against his chest while silently fighting back another wave of tears. Taehyung stepped away before being noticed, but the heartbreaking image refused to leave his mind. For the first time, he realized that whatever Jimin had been hiding was not an act of betrayal or distance, but a burden so overwhelming that it had slowly consumed every part of him, and Taehyung knew that if the truth remained hidden much longer, it would destroy not only Jimin and Jungkook, but the fragile bond holding all of them together. Unable to ignore what he had witnessed, Taehyung began quietly piecing together the fragments that everyone else had overlooked. He noticed how Jimin often returned from his unexplained trips with weary eyes and empty hands, how he carefully hid every receipt, every document, and every trace of where he had been, as though even the smallest clue could unravel everything he had fought to protect. Meanwhile, Jungkook's patience continued to fade, replaced by a quiet heartbreak that he buried beneath determined smiles whenever the others were around. Every passing day deepened the misunderstanding, creating a painful cycle in which Jimin believed distance was the only way to keep Jungkook safe, while Jungkook interpreted that same distance as proof that he had somehow failed the person he cared about most. Taehyung stood helplessly between them, carrying the growing fear that the truth would not arrive in time to save what remained of their unbreakable bond. Then, on a quiet morning when no one expected anything unusual, a single unexpected phone call reached the dormitory, and within moments, the fragile balance that Jimin had sacrificed everything to preserve began to collapse beyond anyone's control. Keeping a careful distance, Taehyung followed Jimin through the rain-soaked streets until he arrived at a quiet building tucked away from the crowded city, a place that seemed strangely familiar yet impossible to understand. Instead of entering through the main entrance, Jimin paused beneath the shelter outside, taking a long, trembling breath before removing the worn envelope from his jacket once more. He stared at it as though saying goodbye to a part of himself, then slowly walked inside with his shoulders weighed down by a burden no one else could see. Taehyung remained hidden across the street, watching every movement with a growing sense of dread. Minutes stretched into what felt like hours before Jimin finally emerged, his eyes swollen with fresh tears and the envelope no longer in his hands. The sight sent a chill through Taehyung, because whatever Jimin had surrendered inside that building had clearly cost him far more than anyone could imagine. At that very moment, Jungkook unknowingly arrived nearby after following a different trail of unanswered questions, setting the stage for a heartbreaking discovery that neither of them was prepared to face. Jungkook stepped out of the taxi just as Jimin disappeared around the corner, leaving only the lingering image of his exhausted figure behind. Confused and driven by a desperate need for answers, he noticed Taehyung standing silently across the street, his expression filled with a mixture of shock and sorrow. Without exchanging a single word, they both looked toward the quiet building where Jimin had vanished moments earlier, sensing that whatever had happened inside was connected to every unanswered question that had haunted them for weeks. Taehyung's instincts urged him to protect Jimin's privacy, yet his heart told him that allowing the silence to continue would only deepen the wounds already tearing them apart. As they cautiously approached the entrance, neither of them realized that the truth waiting beyond those doors would shatter every painful assumption they had made, exposing a sacrifice so profound that Jungkook would soon find himself overwhelmed by guilt, unable to forgive himself for mistaking unconditional love for painful distance. With every step toward the entrance, Jungkook's heartbeat grew louder, as though his heart already sensed that his life was about to change forever. The quiet hallway inside the building felt strangely heavy, lined with soft lights and distant echoes that only deepened the unsettling silence surrounding them. Near the reception desk, Taehyung's eyes fell upon a small visitor log that had been left partially open, and one familiar name immediately caught his attention. Jimin's signature appeared repeatedly over the past several months, each visit carefully recorded on dates that matched every unexplained absence, every cancelled promise, and every moment when he had claimed he simply needed time alone. Jungkook stared at the pages in disbelief, realizing that Jimin had never been disappearing without reason. He had been returning to this place over and over again, carrying a burden so immense that he had chosen to suffer in complete silence rather than allow the people he loved to share even a fraction of his pain. Yet the most heartbreaking truth was still waiting behind one final unopened door, and neither Jungkook nor Taehyung was prepared for what they were about to discover. Drawn forward by equal parts fear and hope, Jungkook slowly reached for the final door at the end of the hallway, his trembling hand hesitating just before the handle. Taehyung remained close behind, sensing that crossing this threshold would erase every assumption they had held onto for weeks. As the door opened, they found a quiet room where the traces of Jimin's hidden visits remained scattered in heartbreaking silence. Carefully organized documents, handwritten notes filled with encouragement, and a calendar marked with countless dates revealed months of quiet devotion that no one had ever known existed. At the center of the room rested the familiar envelope, now lying open on a small table as though it had been intentionally left behind. Jungkook slowly lifted the first page, and before he could finish reading even the opening lines, tears blurred his vision. Every sentence carried the weight of a sacrifice that had never been meant to earn gratitude or recognition, only to protect the people Jimin loved from a burden he believed should belong to him alone. In that devastating moment, Jungkook realized that the distance he had mistaken for abandonment had actually been the greatest act of love Jimin had ever given, and the overwhelming guilt that crashed over him threatened to break his heart before he could even uncover the final truth hidden within the remaining pages. As Jungkook continued turning each fragile page with trembling hands, the full weight of Jimin's hidden struggle slowly unfolded before him. Every carefully written note revealed another silent sacrifice, another painful decision made without expecting appreciation, and another promise to endure loneliness if it meant protecting the people he treasured most. The documents explained why Jimin had disappeared so often, why exhaustion had replaced his bright smile, and why every attempt to ask about his well-being had been met with gentle reassurance instead of honesty. He had convinced himself that carrying the burden alone was an act of love, believing that allowing Jungkook or the others to share his pain would only distract them from their dreams and responsibilities. Tears streamed uncontrollably down Jungkook's face as each memory he had once interpreted as rejection transformed into undeniable proof of Jimin's unwavering devotion. Taehyung stood silently beside him, overwhelmed by the realization that they had all unknowingly watched Jimin fight the hardest battle of his life in complete isolation. Yet among the remaining papers lay one final sealed letter addressed only to Jungkook, its edges worn from being held countless times, suggesting that the most heartbreaking confession of all had never been spoken aloud and was still waiting to change everything forever. With trembling fingers, Jungkook carefully broke the seal of the final letter, his heart pounding so violently that every breath felt painfully heavy. Driven by overwhelming regret, Jungkook rushed from the room with the letter still clutched tightly against his chest, his tears falling freely as every second suddenly felt precious. Taehyung followed close behind, silently praying they had not arrived too late to undo the damage caused by weeks of painful misunderstanding. The rain had begun to fall once again, soaking the empty streets as they searched every place Jimin was known to visit whenever he needed solitude. Each familiar location brought only more silence, deepening Jungkook's fear that the person he had longed to protect had spent too many nights believing he had to face every hardship alone. Every heartbeat echoed with the memories of opportunities lost, comforting words left unspoken, and countless moments when he had mistaken sacrifice for distance. Then, just as hope began slipping away, Taehyung spotted a lone figure standing beneath the dim lights of a quiet riverside bridge, motionless against the falling rain. Even from afar, Jungkook recognized the familiar silhouette immediately, and as he took his first step forward, he realized that the next few moments would determine whether their broken bond could still be healed or whether the silence between them had already become too great to overcome. Jimin stood alone beneath the soft glow of the bridge lights, his soaked clothes clinging to him as the rain quietly washed over his tear-stained face. He gazed at the dark water below, not with despair, but with the exhausted expression of someone who had carried far too much for far too long. The burden he had hidden behind gentle smiles and reassuring gestures had finally become too heavy to bear in silence. As Jungkook drew closer, every painful memory flooded his heart at once, from the countless moments he had questioned Jimin's loyalty to the heartbreaking truth he had only just discovered. Each step felt heavier than the last, weighed down by regret that no apology could ever fully erase. Taehyung remained a short distance behind, understanding that this was no longer a moment for witnesses but for two hearts that had been separated by love expressed through silence instead of honesty. The rain continued to fall between them as the distance slowly disappeared, and for the first time in weeks, Jimin finally turned around. The quiet sorrow reflected in his eyes revealed everything words never could, leaving Jungkook with the painful realization that the greatest wounds between them had never been caused by betrayal, but by two people who had loved each other so deeply that they had each tried to carry the other's pain completely alone. For a long moment, neither of them moved, allowing the quiet rhythm of the falling rain to fill the silence that had separated their hearts for so long. Jungkook held the weathered letter tightly against his chest, its pages now damp from both the rain and the tears that refused to stop. Looking at Jimin through blurred vision, he finally understood that every exhausted smile, every unexplained absence, and every painful step backward had never been signs of fading affection but silent acts of protection born from unconditional love. At the same time, Jimin saw the letter in Jungkook's trembling hands and immediately realized that the truth he had tried so desperately to keep hidden had finally been uncovered. The weight he had carried alone for months seemed to disappear in an instant, replaced by a quiet vulnerability he could no longer conceal. Across the bridge, Taehyung watched with tear-filled eyes, knowing that the secret had finally come to light, yet he also understood that revealing the truth was only the beginning. The deepest wounds were no longer hidden within an unopened envelope, but inside two hearts burdened by regret, guilt, and the painful realization that love could never truly protect someone if it demanded complete silence. As the rain gradually softened into a gentle drizzle, the emotional walls that had kept them apart began to crumble beneath the undeniable truth they now shared. Jungkook realized that the greatest mistake he had made was not failing to notice Jimin's suffering, but believing that love meant never questioning the silence between them. Jimin, in turn, finally accepted that protecting someone did not require carrying every burden alone, because true trust could only exist when pain was shared instead of hidden. The months of misunderstanding had left scars that would never completely disappear, yet those scars became lasting reminders of how easily fear could disguise itself as sacrifice and how quickly silence could be mistaken for rejection. Standing only a few steps away, Taehyung quietly witnessed the beginning of their healing, grateful that fate had revealed the truth before regret became permanent. From that night forward, none of them would ever see strength as the ability to suffer alone again. Instead, they came to understand that the deepest form of courage was allowing the people who loved them to stand beside them through every hardship. And perhaps that was the most heartbreaking lesson of all, that sometimes the greatest act of love is not sacrificing in silence, but trusting someone enough to let them share the weight of your tears before it is too late. In the weeks that followed, the atmosphere within the dormitory slowly transformed. The silence that had once been filled with uncertainty was replaced by quiet understanding, and although the pain of the past could not simply disappear, it no longer stood between them like an invisible wall. Jungkook became more attentive to the smallest changes in Jimin's expression, recognizing that even the strongest smile could conceal an aching heart. Jimin, meanwhile, gradually allowed himself to lean on those who cared for him, discovering that accepting support was not a sign of weakness but a reflection of genuine trust. Jin, Sugar, J-Hope, and Taehyung also found themselves growing closer through the experience, realizing how easily love and concern could remain unnoticed when hidden behind busy schedules and silent endurance. The worn envelope, once a symbol of heartbreaking secrets, was carefully placed inside a small wooden box alongside the letters that had changed everything. It was never opened again, not because its contents had lost their meaning, but because every lesson written within those pages had already become part of the way they chose to live. From then on, whenever life grew difficult, They no longer faced it alone, proving that the strongest bonds are not those that never break, but those that find the courage to heal together after being tested by misunderstanding, sacrifice, and unconditional love. Years later, whenever they looked back on that unforgettable chapter of their lives, none of them remembered the misunderstandings as the moments that defined their bond. Instead, they remembered the night when hidden pain finally gave way to honesty, when tears replaced silence, and when unconditional love proved stronger than fear. The memories of the worn envelope, the lonely bridge, and the countless sleepless nights remained etched in their hearts, not as symbols of sorrow, but as reminders that even the deepest wounds can become the foundation for stronger trust when people choose vulnerability over isolation. Taehyung often reflected on how close they had come to losing something irreplaceable simply because everyone believed they had to appear strong for the sake of one another. That realization quietly changed all of them forever. They learned to ask difficult questions, to listen beyond reassuring smiles, and to stay beside the people they loved even when no words were spoken. In the end, the greatest secret Jimin had ever carried was never the envelope itself, but the belief that love required suffering alone. The greatest gift Jungkook received was discovering that true devotion is measured not by silent sacrifice, but by the courage to share every burden together. And perhaps that is why this story continues to touch so many hearts, reminding us that the people we cherish most do not need perfect strength. They simply need to know that they will never have to face life's darkest moments alone again. As the seasons continue to change, the pain that had once threatened to tear them apart gradually became a quiet source of strength. Every challenge they faced afterward was met not with silence, but with honesty, compassion, and the promise that no one would ever carry an unbearable burden alone again. The tears shed beneath the rain, the forgotten letters, and the heartbreaking misunderstandings became lasting reminders that even the deepest love can lose its way when fear replaces trust. Yet it can also find its way back when hearts choose forgiveness over pride. Taehyung would always remember the night he found Jungkook crying over Jimin's hidden secret, because that single moment forever changed the lives of everyone around him. What began as a story of mystery, heartbreak, and painful distance ultimately became a testament to unwavering loyalty, redemption, and the healing power of unconditional love. And perhaps the greatest lesson of all is this: the people who smile the brightest are sometimes carrying the heaviest burdens, so never wait until tomorrow to remind the ones you love that they do not have to face life's storms alone. If this story touched your heart, let it serve as a gentle reminder to cherish those who stand beside you, speak before silence creates regret, and remember that true love is never measured by the pain we hide, but by the courage we find to heal together.